There's something happening in America right now that you need to see, and I'm going to tell you exactly what it is. But first, let me tell you about something that happened this weekend in Minnesota that will make you stop and ask yourself a question you might not be comfortable answering. This is Alan from the Facts File, and what I'm about to share with you is not just another news story. This is about the moment we're living in right now. Let's start with grief. Deep, profound grief over the murder of beloved actor and director Rob Reiner and his wife. But layered onto that grief is something darker, something that's making people across this country physically recoil. President Trump's response to their deaths. His comments weren't just inappropriate, they were ghoulish, sneering, ugly, almost celebratory, and the visceral reaction people are having to that, it's hard to overstate. Today in Los Angeles, something consequential happened. Trump's deployment of National Guard troops to the city collapsed completely. A federal judge ruled the deployment illegal. The federalized guard units were ordered out. The troops are gone. The order stands. We'll come back to that. But right now, I want to take you somewhere much colder. About 15 miles southwest of Minneapolis, where something extraordinary unfolded over the weekend. It was unplanned. It was spontaneous. It happened outdoors in brutal sub-zero temperatures, and it captured something raw about this moment. ICE agents arrived Saturday morning in a residential neighborhood in Chanhassen, targeting 2 construction workers at a home under construction. The workers climbed into the rafters to avoid detention. Word spread online. Neighbors showed up, then more neighbors, then activists. The goal was simple: do not let these men be taken. People stood outside as temperatures plunged past 20 degrees below zero. They shouted, they pleaded, they demanded ICE leave. EMTs were called when one worker began suffering from exposure. Another remained trapped in the rafters for hours while people below brought blankets, food, hot drinks, literally trying to keep him alive. The scene was tense, frightening, and then the ICE agents withdrew. When they did, people embraced, they chanted, they celebrated not a victory, but a rescue. They locked arms, coordinated cars, shielded the worker as he came down, and helped him leave undetected. The message was unmistakable. We value immigrants in our community, and we will protect them. And here's the question I want you to ask yourself. What did you do with your weekend? How are you living your one wild and precious life? Because what happened there was extraordinary. People climbed into the rafters themselves, refusing to let the man remain alone. The worker was eventually hospitalized for exposure and is expected to recover. That was Saturday. The very next day in Minneapolis, the resistance continued. Postal workers and community members gathered outside post offices after reports that ICE agents had been using postal parking lots to stage operations. Vans, tinted windows, body armor, firearms. Workers said they did not consent. They said they were not cooperating. They said this was not acceptable. Listen to what one worker said. We want a society free of secret police. A society free of secret police. Let that sink in. Minnesota, frozen, furious, and mobilized. And it was only the beginning. What we saw in Minnesota wasn't isolated. It wasn't a one-off. It wasn't confined to one city or one state. As temperatures stayed brutally cold across the Midwest, so did the resolve. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin today, protesters gathered outside the courthouse in 14-degree weather holding signs that read, "Free Judge Dugan." You might remember this case. Back in April, federal agents arrested a sitting judge, Hannah Dugan, inside her own courthouse. The allegation? That she attempted to help a man in her courtroom when ICE agents arrived to detain him. The arrest was swift, public, shocking. A judge perp walked by federal agents. The image alone sent a chill through the legal community. Protests erupted immediately. People rushed to the courthouse, flooded the steps, stood shoulder to shoulder, insisting that arresting a judge for actions taken in her courtroom was wrong. Those protests never stopped. Today marked the beginning of Judge Dugan's trial, and once again Milwaukee turned out in force. Hundreds stood in the cold to show support, not just for her, but for the principle they believe is at stake, that judges should be independent, that courtrooms should not be turned into hunting grounds, that law enforcement power has limits. The protests today weren't just about one judge. They were also in defense of Somali Americans, communities that President Trump has repeatedly targeted with language so blunt, so dehumanizing, it sounds like it was pulled from a different century. Language that many people say belongs in a 1940s propaganda reel, not a modern American presidency. From Wisconsin, the wave spread outward. In Maine this weekend, Democratic candidates for governor and Senate joined rallies in Lewiston in solidarity with Somali neighbors, directly calling out Trump's rhetoric and the federal enforcement actions tied to it. In Huntington, New York, protesters gathered outside a local police station after reports that local police had assisted federal immigration agents. The message was clear: local law enforcement should not be complicit. In Louisiana, protests erupted across multiple cities: Baton Rouge, Kenner, Gonzales. Diverse, loud, persistent. As demonstrators flooded the streets, the state's attorney general found herself fielding pointed questions from local reporters, forced to defend why Louisiana was cooperating with federal immigration operations, while residents were openly rejecting them. All of this has been unfolding as I've been thinking deeply about the history of Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants who were rounded up, imprisoned by the U.S. government during World War II, and later formally apologized to. People who were paid restitution because the country eventually acknowledged what had been done was wrong. One of the places where that history unfolded was Fort Bliss in Texas. And today, Fort Bliss is back in the news. The Trump administration has turned that same site into what is now its largest detention facility for immigrants. Nearly 3,000 people are currently held there. Plans are underway to expand it to 5,000. New reports from the ACLU and other watchdog groups describe deeply troubling conditions inside. Last week, reports emerged of a man dying there. This weekend, residents of El Paso protested along the road leading to Fort Bliss, protesting the revival of a place with such a heavy historical legacy of injustice. Across the country, protests are spreading to unexpected places. Home Depot stores have become frequent sites of demonstration. The reason is simple. ICE agents have been using Home Depot parking lots and stores as staging areas for raids, and Home Depot as a corporation has refused to respond. In Manhattan this weekend, protesters filled a Home Depot store, chanting in the aisles, calling on shoppers to stand with immigrants. In California, protesters arrived wearing Santa hats, singing carols rewritten with biting lyrics, urging a boycott if the company continues to stay silent. In Albany, New York, the same scene. Pickets, chants, demands for accountability. Apple stores have also become flashpoints. In Portland, Oregon, and South Lake, Texas, protesters gathered after Apple removed an app called Ice Block from the App Store at the request of the Trump administration. The app allowed users to alert neighbors about sightings of federal immigration agents. Apple complied. Protesters are demanding the app be reinstated. They're calling out Apple CEO Tim Cook directly, accusing the company of caving under pressure. Even President Trump himself has not been insulated. Protesters confronted him as he arrived at the Army-Navy game this weekend. Signs read, "Don't obey illegal orders," "No war crimes with my tax dollars," "Baltimore says no to tyranny." And today, just steps from the White House, demonstrators unfurled an enormous image on the National Mall, a massive photograph of Donald Trump alongside Jeffrey Epstein. The timing was deliberate. Some version of the Epstein files is expected to be released later this week. And here's what should terrify Trump's team. A new Reuters poll shows that fewer than 20% of Americans now believe Trump didn't know about Epstein's crimes, less than 20%. That shift matters, because at the same time all of this is happening in the streets, something else is happening quietly in the numbers. Trump's approval ratings are collapsing. Not just overall, but on the issues he cares about most. And that collapse is beginning to show up in places many people might not expect. The data no longer supports the narrative that Trump is somehow immune to gravity. According to the latest Associated Press polling, Trump's approval on the economy stands at 31%. 67% of Americans disapprove. That puts him underwater by 36 points on what he repeatedly calls his strongest issue. On healthcare, it's even worse. He is underwater by 40 points. And here's something important. That healthcare polling was completed before today, before millions of Americans began feeling the full effects of policy changes made earlier this year. Today is the deadline for Americans to sign up for health insurance coverage under the Affordable Care Act for plans beginning January 1st. Tens of millions rely on those plans, and for roughly 22 million Americans, premiums are about to spike dramatically, in many cases double. This is not inflation. This is not a market fluctuation. This is not an accident. This is a direct result of a policy decision. The elimination of subsidies that supported those plans. A switch flipped, a safeguard removed. The result is predictable and immediate, and the political consequences are already being felt. What's striking is where this is showing up, not just in New York, not just in California, but in red states, in local nightly news broadcasts, in places where Republican presidents typically enjoy a friendly environment. Take Tulsa, Oklahoma. Local news coverage there recently showed protesters from indivisible Tulsa County gathering to call for unity, lower food prices, and peace abroad. When asked why they were speaking out, organizers didn't hedge. They talked about affordability, about the cost of living, about being told what their children should or shouldn't have for Christmas. And then came the quote that stunned viewers, played straight without commentary. President Trump saying, "You don't need $37 for your daughter. 2 or 3 is nice, but you don't need 37." The local reporter didn't editorialize, didn't soften it, just moved on. That's when you know something has shifted. When local news in Oklahoma is airing those moments without apology, without spin, without defense, it tells you the political weather has changed, and politicians can feel that change. In Indiana, Republican legislators were recently pressured by Trump to redraw their congressional maps. Traditionally, that kind of demand from a president would be met with swift compliance. This time it wasn't. Indiana Republicans said no, publicly, repeatedly, and they did so after days of protests at the state capitol. Protesters showing up again and again demanding that their representatives stand up to the White House. Yes, those protesters mattered. They showed resolve, persistence. But so did the numbers. Because politicians read polls, they read approval ratings, they read the room. And with Trump, this unpopular, this embattled, this closely associated with chaos and cruelty, saying no suddenly looks safer than saying yes. We're seeing this calculation play out elsewhere too. In Maine, Governor Janet Mills announced today that the state is ending its policy of local law enforcement cooperation with federal immigration agents. She made the case plainly. The policy no longer reflects the values or the will of the people. That decision didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened amid protests, amid polling shifts, amid visible backlash. The cold weather may be harsh, but the political climate has turned even harsher for the White House. And immigration, the issue Trump has always relied on as a political weapon, is no longer protecting him. In the same AP polling, Trump is 22 points underwater on immigration. 22. That should stop everyone in Washington in their tracks, because when the signature issue fails, the entire strategy begins to collapse, and the consequences of that collapse are now spreading into governance itself. At the FBI, turmoil has spilled into public view. Leadership shakeups, stalled investigations, internal discord leaking into the open, undermining confidence in an agency that relies on credibility to function. Former officials are speaking out. Career staff are warning quietly that morale is collapsing. What was once guarded institutional silence is giving way to visible strain. At the Department of Veterans Affairs, the situation is even more stark. The Trump administration has announced plans to cut 35,000 healthcare positions at the VA. Doctors, nurses, support staff. 35,000 jobs eliminated in a system already struggling to meet demand. Merry Christmas, veterans. That is not hyperbole. That is the timing. At FEMA, the agency responsible for disaster response and recovery, the situation borders on surreal. In a move that stunned emergency management professionals, Trump appointed a new leader for the Office of Response and Recovery who has no meaningful experience in emergency response at all. What he does have is a public record of insisting that the 2020 election was stolen. And not just that election. He has claimed the 2016 election was also stolen, despite the fact that Trump won it. That belief is now his credential. He is being placed in charge of how the federal government responds to disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, floods, at a time when climate-driven emergencies are increasing in frequency and severity. Ask Texas how FEMA has been performing lately. Ask communities still waiting for assistance. Ask survivors navigating delays, denials, and confusion. This is not theoretical. These decisions have consequences measured in lives, homes, and livelihoods. And yet from the White House, the message remains the same. Loyalty first, competence second, or not at all. As this pattern repeats itself across agencies, governors are responding. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom is openly celebrating the court-ordered collapse of Trump's illegal National Guard deployment in Los Angeles. But he isn't stopping there. Newsom is actively recruiting top public health officials away from Washington, hiring them to come work for California instead. His message is blunt. If you want to do serious world-class public health work, leave the federal government and come here. Come work for a real government. That contrast is deliberate, and it's being noticed. Because while the Trump administration lashes out, sneers at victims, and dismantles institutions, state governments are positioning themselves as alternatives, as places of stability, competence, and resistance. This is not just politics. This is power shifting downward. It's also happening because Trump himself has become radioactive. His approval ratings are not just low. They are dragging down everyone associated with him. Republican politicians are quietly recalculating. Some are backing away. Others are drawing lines they once would not have dared to draw. Because no one wants to go down with a president this unpopular. And the public sees it. People see the cruelty. They see the chaos. They see the performative violence against immigrants, and increasingly they are rejecting it. The same tactics that once energized Trump's base are now repelling the broader electorate. The spectacle has worn thin. The cost has become too visible. And that brings us back to where this all began, to people standing in sub-zero temperatures in Minnesota forming human shields, to judges being arrested and defended, to workers saying they want a society free of secret police, to communities deciding they will not comply quietly. These are not isolated protests. They are signals. They are signs of a country pushing back, not just emotionally but structurally. And when that pushback coincides with collapsing approval, institutional failure, and legal defeats, the outcome becomes harder to contain. The political weather has changed, and the storm is no longer theoretical. Now let's return to the deadline that quietly arrives tonight, because it may end up affecting more Americans than any single protest or headline. At midnight, the window closes for millions of people trying to sign up for health insurance under the Affordable Care Act, and for roughly 22 million Americans who rely on that coverage, what happens next is not abstract. It's financial, it's medical, it's personal. Because of decisions made earlier this year by President Trump and congressional Republicans, the subsidies that kept ACA plans affordable are expiring. They were not replaced, they were not extended, they were cut, and now the bill is coming due. For many families, premiums are about to double. Not increase modestly, not creep upward. Double. This is not inflation. This is not market fluctuation. This is not some unforeseen shock. This is a deliberate policy choice, a switch flipped, a line removed from legislation, a consequence fully understood at the time it was enacted. And it begins hitting households tomorrow. Parents who budgeted carefully will be forced to choose between coverage and rent. Seniors not yet eligible for Medicare will face gaps in care. People with chronic conditions will confront impossible trade-offs, prescriptions or premiums, appointments or groceries, and all of it traces directly back to Washington. The administration has no fix ready, no mitigation plan, no emergency response, just messaging, dismissive, minimizing, often mocking. That tone matters, because when leaders respond to pain by shrugging, people notice, and they remember. This is why approval ratings are collapsing, not just broadly, but on Trump's core issues: the economy, healthcare, immigration. The very pillars he claims define his leadership. On the economy, he is underwater by more than 30 points. On healthcare, closer to 40. Even on immigration, his signature issue, he's now more than 20 points underwater. That is not partisan erosion. That is structural rejection, and it's reshaping behavior. In Indiana, Republican lawmakers faced intense pressure from Trump to redraw congressional maps to his advantage. He demanded compliance. He expected obedience. Instead, they said no, not quietly, not behind closed doors, publicly, repeatedly. Why? Because they could read the weather. Because protesters filled the State House. Because polling showed Trump dragging down everyone near him. Because aligning with him now carries political risk, not protection. That shift matters. It signals that fear is weakening, that the gravitational pull of Trump's power is loosening, that politicians who once bent automatically are beginning to calculate differently. And those calculations are being driven by people, by turnout, by protest, by sustained resistance. This is how political eras end, not with a single event, but with accumulation, with judges enforcing boundaries, with courts issuing orders that cannot be ignored, with states asserting autonomy, with corporations facing boycotts, with voters changing behavior, with allies distancing themselves, and with the narrative breaking. The story is no longer one of inevitability or dominance. It is one of overreach, of exhaustion, of backlash. A presidency that once thrived on spectacle is now drowning in consequence, and the country is responding. Not all at once, not uniformly, but unmistakably. This is no longer just about one man or one administration. It is about whether institutions hold, whether laws matter, whether cruelty pays, whether democracy asserts itself before the damage becomes irreversible. That question is no longer theoretical. It is being answered right now in courtrooms, in statehouses, in freezing streets, and in millions of living rooms, where families are opening insurance notices they cannot afford. History rarely announces itself in advance, but sometimes you can feel the hinge turning, and this feels like one of those moments. We'll continue to follow it closely. Stay with us.